The pregnant girl refused to speak until the lonely lumberjack played his harmonica. The silence was so thick it could cut through the desert air like a rusted blade. On the weathered wooden porch, a girl barely 18 years old sat motionless, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly, while her dark eyes stared into the dusty horizon of New Mexico. She had arrived 3 days ago, walking barefoot down the dirt path leading to the lumberjack's cabin, her dress torn and her gaze empty like someone who had lost all hope. But what nobody knew was that this girl harbored a secret so devastating it would forever change the life of the loneliest man in the territory. Miguel Hernandez had spent 15 years living in those arid mountains, cutting timber for nearby ranches and running from a past that haunted him like shadows at high noon. His adobe and wood cabin stood isolated among the juniper trees and red rocks, miles away from the nearest settlement. The only sounds that broke the desert silence were the rhythmic thud of his axe against dry wood and the mournful wail of coyotes at night. The morning she appeared was like any other. Miguel emerged from his cabin at dawn, the cool mountain air filling his lungs as he prepared for another day of solitary labor. The sun painted the mesas in shades of amber and crimson, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. That was when he saw her sitting there, as if she had materialized from the desert itself. Her long black hair fell like a curtain around her shoulders, and her olive skin bore the telltale signs of days spent under the unforgiving southwestern sun. The simple cotton dress she wore was faded and patched, suggesting a life of hardship that had led her to this remote corner of the world. But it was her eyes that struck Miguel most profoundly. They held a depth of pain that seemed far too heavy for someone so young to carry. Miguel approached cautiously, his weathered hands hanging at his sides. He had learned long ago that desperate people could be dangerous, especially in this lawless territory where Apache raids and bandits made survival a daily struggle. The girl did not flinch as he drew near, nor did she acknowledge his presence with even the slightest gesture. He cleared his throat softly and spoke in Spanish, then English, offering her water and shelter. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. Miguel noticed the way she held her belly, protective and tender, and realized she was with child. His heart stirred with an emotion he had forgotten existed after years of isolation. The first day passed in this strange tableau. Miguel went about his work, stealing glances at the mysterious girl who had claimed his porch as her sanctuary. He left food and water beside her, which she consumed when he was not looking. As evening approached, he offered her his bed, but she simply shook her head and remained on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket he had provided. The second day brought no change. Miguel found himself distracted from his work, his mind constantly returning to the silent figure on his porch. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to share his space with another human being. The girl's presence was both comforting and unsettling, like a beautiful song played in a minor key. On the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the western peaks and painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Miguel sat on his porch steps near the girl. The temperature dropped quickly in the desert, and he could see her shivering despite the blanket. Without speaking, he rose and brought her his heaviest coat, draping it gently over her shoulders. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes, dark as midnight, met his for just a moment before she lowered her gaze again. In that brief connection, Miguel saw a flicker of gratitude mixed with profound sadness. He wanted to ask her name, to know where she had come from and what had brought her to his doorstep. But something in her demeanor warned him against pressing for answers. The fourth day arrived with an unexpected chill. Gray clouds gathered over the mountains, threatening the first rain the region had seen in months. Miguel worked closer to the cabin, keeping the girl within sight as the wind picked up and scattered dust across the landscape. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, and he noticed her hands trembling not just from cold, but from something deeper. That evening, as lightning flickered in the distance and thunder rolled across the desert, Miguel made a decision that would change everything. He retrieved something from inside his cabin that he had not touched in years, a small harmonica his father had given him as a child. The instrument was tarnished silver, worn smooth by countless hours of playing during his younger days, when music had been his refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. He sat on the porch steps, the harmonica cold in his weathered hands, The girl watched him from the corner of her eye, and Miguel felt a strange nervousness he had not experienced in decades. Slowly, he raised the instrument to his lips and began to play a melody his father had taught him long ago. The notes were tentative at first, rusty from years of disuse, but gradually they grew stronger and more confident. The melody was simple yet haunting, a Mexican folk song about lost love and hope enduring through hardship. As the music filled the desert air, something remarkable happened. The girl's rigid posture began to soften, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. Miguel continued playing, pouring all his loneliness and longing into the small instrument. When he finished, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty, but full of possibility, like the moment before dawn, when darkness gives way to light. The girl turned to face him fully, and Miguel saw that her eyes were no longer vacant, but alive with emotion. She spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear in the desert stillness. Her words were in Spanish, heavily accented with what Miguel recognized as a Mexican dialect from the southern regions. "My name is Esperanza," she said, the word meaning hope in Spanish. "I have been running for 3 months." Miguel nodded, understanding that this was the beginning of her story, not the end. He continued to hold the harmonica, ready to play again if she needed the comfort of music to continue. Esperanza's story unfolded slowly over the following days, revealed in fragments during the quiet hours when Miguel would play his harmonica, and she would find the strength to speak. She had grown up in a small village in Sonora, Mexico, where her family worked the fields of a wealthy landowner. At 17, she had fallen in love with a young man named Carlos, the son of a local merchant. Their love was innocent and pure, but it was also forbidden by the strict social hierarchy that governed their world. When Esperanza discovered she was pregnant, Carlos promised to marry her despite his family's objections. But before they could wed, tragedy struck. A group of bandits raided their village, and Carlos was killed trying to protect his family's store. Esperanza's own family, shamed by her pregnancy and unable to provide for another mouth to feed, turned her away. With nowhere else to go, Esperanza began walking north toward the American border, following rumors of work and sanctuary in the territories. She had endured countless hardships during her journey, sleeping in the open desert, begging for food and water, avoiding both bandits and Apache war parties that roamed the borderlands. The most devastating part of her story came when she revealed why she had stopped speaking. 3 weeks before arriving at Miguel's cabin, she had been captured by a group of men who intended to sell her into slavery. She had escaped during the night, but not before witnessing horrors that had stolen her voice and nearly broken her spirit completely. Miguel listened to every word without judgment, his heart breaking for this brave young woman who had endured so much. He understood her silence and respected the courage it had taken for her to speak at all. As the days passed, he found himself looking forward to the evenings when he would play his harmonica and she would share more of her story. The music became their bridge, connecting two souls who had both been wounded by life's cruelties. Miguel began teaching Esperanza simple melodies, and she would hum along softly, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. He also started sharing his own story, telling her about his childhood in Texas, his family's death from cholera, and the years of wandering that had led him to this isolated cabin. As autumn deepened into winter, Esperanza's pregnancy advanced. Miguel found himself preparing for the birth with a mixture of excitement and terror. He had delivered calves and foals, but never a human child. He gathered supplies from the nearest town, a day's ride away, and tried to learn everything he could about childbirth from the few women he encountered. The baby arrived on a cold December morning when snow dusted the mountain peaks. Esperanza's labor was long and difficult, and Miguel feared he might lose both mother and child. But as the sun rose over the desert, painting the world in gold and silver, a healthy baby girl entered the world with a cry that echoed across the silent landscape. Esperanza wept with joy and exhaustion as she held her daughter, and Miguel felt tears streaming down his own weathered cheeks. The baby was perfect, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. They named her Luz, meaning light, because she had brought illumination to their darkest hours. As winter melted into spring, Miguel found himself transformed by the presence of Esperanza and baby Luz. His cabin, once a refuge from the world, became a home filled with laughter and purpose. He taught Esperanza to read and write in English, and she helped him remember what it meant to be part of a family. The harmonica remained central to their daily routine, its melodies marking the passage of time and the deepening of their bond. But their peace was not destined to last. One morning in late spring, as Miguel was teaching Luz to walk in the garden they had planted together, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Miguel's blood ran cold as he recognized the leader, his brother Carlos, whom he had not seen in 20 years. Carlos Hernandez was everything Miguel was not: wealthy, powerful, and connected to the territorial government. He had spent decades building a cattle empire while Miguel had chosen exile and solitude. The brothers had parted ways after a bitter dispute over their family's land, and Miguel had assumed he would never see Carlos again. The confrontation was inevitable. Carlos had come to claim what he believed was rightfully his, the land where Miguel had built his cabin. Armed with legal documents and backed by territorial law, he demanded that Miguel vacate the property within 30 days. But it was not just the land Carlos wanted. He had heard rumors about the Mexican girl and her child, and he saw them as a threat to his reputation and standing in the community. Miguel stood his ground, literally and figuratively. He had spent 15 years turning this harsh land into something beautiful and productive. He had built his cabin with his own hands, cleared the fields, and diverted a stream to create the garden where Luz now played. More importantly, this place had become home to Esperanza and their daughter, and he would not see them cast out into an uncertain world. The legal battle that followed was brutal and one-sided. Carlos had money and influence, while Miguel had only his determination and the righteousness of his cause. The territorial courts, dominated by wealthy landowners like Carlos, ruled in favor of the brother who could pay the most bribes and wield the most political power. As the deadline approached, Miguel faced an impossible choice. He could fight and likely lose everything, including his life, or he could surrender and find another way to protect the family he had come to love. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the desert heat, suffocating and inescapable. It was Esperanza who provided the answer. On the night before the final court hearing, she sat beside Miguel on their porch, baby Luz sleeping peacefully in her arms. The harmonica lay between them, its silver surface reflecting the moonlight like a small beacon of hope. "Play for me," she whispered, her voice now strong and clear after months of healing. "Play the song that brought us together." Miguel raised the harmonica to his lips and began the melody that had first broken through her silence. As the notes floated across the desert night, Esperanza began to sing. Her voice was pure and heartbreaking, telling the story of their love and the family they had built together. The song spoke of sacrifice and courage, of choosing love over pride and family over fortune. When the music ended, Miguel understood what he had to do. He would not fight Carlos in court or with violence. Instead, he would make the ultimate sacrifice. He would walk away from the land he loved to protect the people he loved even more. But he would not go quietly, or without ensuring that Esperanza and Luz would be safe and provided for. The next morning, Miguel appeared in court not as a defeated man, but as someone who had found his true purpose. He announced that he would relinquish his claim to the land on one condition. Carlos must provide a generous settlement that would allow Esperanza and Luz to start a new life wherever they chose to go. The money would be held in trust, ensuring their security for years to come. Carlos, surprised by his brother's unexpected surrender, agreed to the terms. He had expected a fight and was prepared for one, but Miguel's peaceful resolution caught him off guard. Perhaps somewhere in his hardened heart, he still remembered the brother he had once loved, and he honored the agreement without attempting to cheat or deceive. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been their sanctuary, Miguel and Esperanza made one final decision together. They would travel to California, where opportunities were said to be plentiful and where their unconventional family might find acceptance. The journey would be long and difficult, but they would face it together, bound by love and music and the unbreakable bonds they had forged in the desert. On their last morning in the cabin, as the sun rose over the mountains they had called home, Miguel played his harmonica one final time. The melody was different now, not sad but hopeful, speaking of new beginnings and the courage to start over. Esperanza sang along, her voice joining his in perfect harmony, while baby Luz gurgled and reached for the shining instrument that had brought her parents together. They packed their few belongings into a wagon Miguel had purchased with part of the settlement money. As they drove away from the cabin, none of them looked back. They were not fleeing from their past, but moving toward their future, guided by the music that had saved them both and the love that had transformed their lives. The desert stretched before them, vast and challenging, but no longer empty. They carried with them the harmonies of their shared story, the rhythm of their beating hearts, and the promise of new songs yet to be written in the land of endless possibilities that lay ahead. Years later, when people asked Miguel about the pregnant girl who had refused to speak until he played his harmonica, he would smile and pull out the tarnished silver instrument that had changed his life. He would play a few notes of that haunting melody, and those who listened closely could hear not just the music, but the story itself. A tale of love conquering silence, of hope surviving despair, and of two broken souls finding wholeness in the most unlikely of places. The harmonica still plays in California, where Miguel and Esperanza built a new home and raised their daughter to believe in the power of music to heal even the deepest wounds. And sometimes, on quiet desert nights, when the wind is just right, travelers claim they can still hear those notes echoing across the New Mexico landscape, reminding everyone who listens that love and music have the power to transform even the most barren places into gardens of hope. The journey to California proved to be every bit as challenging as Miguel had anticipated. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they rolled across the unforgiving terrain, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything they owned. Baby Luz, now 6 months old, seemed to sense the uncertainty of their situation and cried more frequently than usual. Esperanza, still recovering from childbirth and the emotional trauma of leaving their sanctuary, struggled with bouts of melancholy that worried Miguel deeply. Their first major obstacle came in the form of a flash flood that washed out the bridge they needed to cross. The swollen river raged with brown water and debris, making passage impossible for several days. They were forced to camp on the riverbank with a group of other travelers, sharing meager supplies and swapping stories around evening fires. It was during this delay that Miguel began to understand the true strength of the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. Esperanza took charge of organizing the other stranded families, many of whom had children who were hungry and frightened. She shared their food without hesitation, sang lullabies to crying babies, and helped the women tend to sick family members. Her natural leadership and compassion shone through, and Miguel watched with growing admiration as she transformed from a broken girl into a woman of remarkable resilience. When the waters finally receded, they discovered that their wagon had suffered damage from the constant moisture. The wooden axle had begun to crack, and Miguel knew it would not survive the remaining journey to California. Using the last of their emergency funds, he purchased a replacement part from a traveling merchant who charged them twice the normal price, knowing they had no choice but to pay. The delay had cost them precious time, and winter was approaching faster than they had planned. The higher elevations they needed to cross would soon be impassable due to snow, and Miguel felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death for his family, and the pressure was almost unbearable. It was during their darkest moment, when they had been traveling for 3 weeks and their food supplies were running dangerously low, that they encountered a group of Apache warriors. Miguel's heart hammered in his chest as he saw the painted faces and weapons of the 6 men who emerged from behind a rocky outcrop. He had heard countless stories of settler families being massacred by Apache raiding parties, and he feared that their journey would end in tragedy. The leader of the Apache group, a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of countless battles, approached their wagon cautiously. Miguel kept his hands visible and spoke in the few Apache words he had learned during his years in the territory. To his surprise, the warrior responded in broken English, asking about their destination and purpose. What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted for hours. The Apache were not interested in violence, but were monitoring the movement of whites through their traditional hunting grounds. They had seen the signs of Miguel's small family struggling through the desert and had come to investigate. The warrior leader, whose name was Nalnish, seemed particularly interested in baby Luz, who had been fussing throughout the encounter. Esperanza, showing remarkable courage, began to sing softly to calm her daughter. The melody was one of the Mexican folk songs Miguel had taught her, and her voice carried across the desert air with haunting beauty. The Apache warriors listened in silence, and Miguel could see something shift in their expressions. Music, it seemed, was a universal language that transcended cultural barriers. Nalnish spoke quietly to his companions in their native tongue, then turned back to Miguel and Esperanza. In his broken English, he explained that his own daughter had died in childbirth the previous winter, and the sound of Esperanza's lullaby had moved him deeply. Rather than viewing them as threats, the Apache decided to offer assistance. The warriors shared their knowledge of the terrain ahead, warning Miguel about dangerous passages and recommending alternative routes that would save them several days of travel. They also provided dried meat and water, resources that were desperately needed. In return, Esperanza continued to sing, her voice providing comfort to men who had seen too much war and loss. When the Apache finally departed, Miguel felt as though they had received a blessing rather than a threat. The encounter had taught him that even in the most dangerous situations, human connections could transcend fear and prejudice. He looked at Esperanza with new eyes, understanding that her gift for music and compassion made her far more than just a companion. She was a bridge between worlds, capable of touching hearts regardless of language or culture. The remaining journey to California was marked by smaller challenges that tested their resolve daily. They faced sandstorms that forced them to take shelter for days at a time, their wagon buried in drifting sand that required hours of digging to escape. The desert sun was merciless during the day, while the nights brought bone-chilling cold that made sleep almost impossible. Miguel's hands became cracked and bleeding from handling the reins and constantly repairing their wagon. Esperanza's face grew thin from rationing her food to ensure there was enough for Luz, who was completely dependent on her mother's milk. They both lost weight and aged years in the span of months, but their love for each other and their determination to build a new life kept them moving forward. The first sight of California's green valleys was like a vision from heaven. After months of brown desert and rocky mountains, the sight of actual trees and grass brought tears to their eyes. They had made it through the worst of the journey, but their challenges were far from over. California in the 1850s was a place of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single day. They settled initially in a small farming community outside Los Angeles, where Miguel found work as a carpenter and Esperanza took in washing and mending. The townspeople were initially suspicious of the Mexican woman and her Anglo companion, but Esperanza's warm personality and Miguel's skilled craftsmanship gradually won them acceptance. Luz grew into a beautiful and intelligent child who charmed everyone she met with her bright smile and musical laughter. Miguel established a small woodworking shop, creating furniture and tools for the growing community. His reputation for quality work spread quickly, and soon he had more orders than he could handle. Esperanza started a small garden behind their rented cottage, growing vegetables and herbs that she sold at the local market. Her knowledge of Mexican cooking brought new flavors to the community, and she began teaching other women how to prepare traditional dishes. But it was music that truly established their place in the community. Miguel's harmonica playing became legendary at local gatherings, and Esperanza's singing voice drew people from miles around. They performed at weddings, harvest celebrations, and community meetings, their music bringing joy and unity to people who had come from all corners of the world seeking new lives. As the years passed, they saved enough money to purchase a small plot of land on the outskirts of town. Miguel built their home with his own hands, incorporating design elements from both his Texas childhood and Esperanza's Mexican heritage. The house was modest but beautiful, with a wide front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch Luz play in the garden. Luz grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Miguel's Anglo traditions and Esperanza's Mexican customs. She learned to play the harmonica from her adoptive father and inherited her mother's beautiful singing voice. The child who had been born in a desert cabin became a young woman who embodied the best of both worlds. When Luz turned 16, she announced her intention to become a teacher, inspired by her own experiences, learning to read and write in both English and Spanish. Miguel and Esperanza were proud of her ambition and worked extra hours to save money for her education. They had never formally married, but their commitment to each other and their daughter was stronger than any legal document. The The success of their small family attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Carlos Hernandez, Miguel's wealthy brother, arrived in California on business and learned of his brother's new life. The years had mellowed the older man, and he came not as an enemy, but as someone seeking reconciliation. He had built his cattle empire, but had never found the happiness that seemed to radiate from Miguel's simple home. The reunion between the brothers was emotional and complex. Carlos apologized for his past actions and offered to help Miguel expand his business. Miguel, now confident in his choices and secure in his family's love, was able to forgive his brother while maintaining his independence. The two men would never be close friends, but they found a way to coexist peacefully. Carlos also brought news from New Mexico that would change everything. The cabin where Miguel and Esperanza had fallen in love had been abandoned and was now available for purchase. The land had proven too difficult to develop, and Carlos was willing to sell it back to Miguel for a fraction of its original value. The offer presented them with an impossible choice: stay in California where they had built successful lives, or return to the place where their love story had begun. The decision was ultimately made by Luz herself. Now 18 and about to begin her teaching career, she encouraged her parents to follow their hearts. She would remain in California to pursue her education and career, but she wanted them to find the happiness that had eluded them since leaving New Mexico. The desert cabin represented more than just a home. It was the place where two broken souls had found healing and love. Miguel and Esperanza spent their final months in California preparing for their return to New Mexico. They sold their house and business, keeping only the essentials and the harmonica that had brought them together. The community they were leaving behind had become family, and the farewell celebrations lasted for days. People who had once viewed them with suspicion now wept to see them go. The journey back to New Mexico was vastly different from their desperate flight years earlier. They traveled in comfort, with supplies and money, taking time to enjoy the landscapes they had once viewed as obstacles. The desert, that had once seemed harsh and unwelcoming, now appeared beautiful and familiar, like an old friend waiting to welcome them home. When they finally arrived at the cabin, they found it exactly as they had left it, though weathered by years of neglect. The garden they had planted was overgrown, the windows were cracked, and the roof needed repair. But the bones of their sanctuary remained strong, and they could see the potential for restoration. Miguel threw himself into the work of rebuilding, his skilled hands remembering every detail of the home he had created. Esperanza cleaned and organized, hanging curtains and arranging furniture with the same care she had shown years earlier. The harmonica that had brought them together was placed in a place of honor on the mantel, a reminder of the music that had saved them both. Their second beginning in the desert cabin was even more beautiful than their first. They were no longer desperate refugees, but mature adults who had chosen to return to the place that held their most precious memories. The isolation they had once endured out of necessity now became a deliberate choice, a way of life that allowed them to focus on what truly mattered. Luz visited them regularly, bringing news from California and eventually introducing them to her husband and children. The cabin that had once sheltered a pregnant girl and a lonely lumberjack became a gathering place for 3 generations, filled with laughter and music and the continuing story of a love that had conquered every obstacle. Miguel continued to play his harmonica every evening, and Esperanza still sang the songs that had first broken through her silence. But now their music was joined by the voices of their grandchildren, creating harmonies that echoed across the desert and celebrated the enduring power of love to transform even the most barren places into gardens of hope and joy.